Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm honored to present a very special installment in my series of community spotlight videos in which I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to none other than one of the most competent and skillful players in our entire LCG community, the gentleman who was recently crowned 2015 Conquest LCG World Champion, Varun Khetarpal. Specifically, we discuss his beginnings in gaming, his competitive background, as well as his preparation for Worlds. We talk about the philosophy behind his approach to the game, and also discuss the finer points of the Packmaster Kith deck list with which he claimed the championship, all in the context of our current metagame. And of course, he provides a wealth of both wisdom and advice to anyone hoping to become a more competitive and competent player. So, if you enjoy this video, remember to hit the like button, ensure you're subscribed, and you're always encouraged to share, because the more engagement this video receives, the more viewers are reached, and ever the broader you help grow the Conquest community. But with our introduction aside, I'm honored to bring you an interview with our 2015 Conquest LCG World Champion, Varun Khetarpal. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but as a means of starting things off, why don't you introduce yourself and let our good viewers at home know just a little bit about how you're personally involved in the Conquest community.
Okay, so my name's Varun. I'm also GK Zukov on Card Game DB, and I won the UK National Championships and more recently the World Championships.
Right. I mean, you've had an absolutely fantastic tournament presence. You won nationals, like you mentioned. You suddenly were on everybody's radar, and we just finished with the 2015 Conquest LCG World Championship event, and you were able to steal the title. So, an absolutely fantastic showing. But, Varun, what exactly is your history in gaming? Like, what's a bit of your background, and how did you first get interested in any kind of gaming?
So when I was young, I sort of played a few board games that everyone does, like Monopoly, Scrabble. My dad introduced me to chess. I then had a brief period where I played some of the Games Workshop games and some collectible card games, such as Magic and also the Lord of the Rings Decipher one. But I didn't play those for a particularly long time, and then there was a few years where I didn't really do much gaming at all. And then I guess at some point in the last few years, I sort of got back into both card games and board games, played the Game of Thrones LCG for about a year, kind of not particularly intensively, probably like only once or twice a month over that year. And then that play group kind of dissipated. And about couple of years ago, I think I sort of started playing a lot more board games with people, came across Conquest. It looked really good. Me and a couple of friends of mine decided to buy 3 core sets and split them 3 ways so we could each kind of play a bit without massively investing, and then it kind of took off from there, really.
Sure. I guess, what is it about competitive gaming specifically that sparked a bit of an interest with you? Like you mentioned, a history in Magic the Gathering, some of the other LCGs, but why continue to compete to this day? Like, what was the initial allure, and why even attempt to compete on a national, let alone a world level?
I think I've always had a bit of that competitive streak. Kind of not in a needing to win way, like, you know, in a having fun but trying to win at the same time. I think especially more recently, sort of work-wise and study-wise, I've very much gone down the kind of more artsy and creative routes. I'm a counsellor at the moment. I was a teacher before that. I did a creative writing degree, and but sort of growing up, kind of maths and logic and that kind of more strategic type of mindset always appealed to me. So I think it's it gives me the option to still kind of play around with that side of myself.
Sure.
That doesn't necessarily appear in my day to day. And yeah, I do like to try and win things. I don't know where that came from really. I'll probably have to sit down and think about that one day.
Well,
But I definitely have a competitive streak.
yeah, I mean, I can definitely empathize. I went down the mental health counseling and therapy route myself, eventually becoming a therapist, but I always had a background and interest in medicine, biology, and the various, natural sciences. So,
Yeah.
personally, I really love the mathematical aspects of gaming just because it lets me flex some mental muscles I normally don't have the opportunity to. But when it all comes down to it, out of all the different games you could play out there, Game of Thrones, Magic the Gathering, whatever it happens to be, why exactly stick with Conquest? What is the unique appeal of this game?
I think I've so again looking back at some of the games I played earlier, I've obviously had an interest in card games as well as board games. I'm a big fan of some of the deck building games out there, like Trains and Core Worlds. So that kind of card side and that building your own deck, that does appeal to me. And I've played games like poker a little bit casually in the past as well. But there's also that part of me that really likes the tactical side, the kind of almost more wargaming side. And out of all the card games out there, especially out of all the LCGs out there, I think Conquest provides this kind of area control aspect with the planets, this slight bluffing mechanic with the warlords, this kind of really tactical aspect, deciding between trying to win command, trying to win combat, which planet you go to when. You are kind of playing on a board. It kind of is a card game and a board game at the same time. And the depth of the strategy and tactics really appeals to me. So yeah, I guess that's the thing it has that other games don't. It also, I feel like you have more control over things. So as much as I played a lot of these different card games and things over the years, I don't really like it when it's just a case of I drew better than you or you drew better than me. And obviously that happens a bit in Conquest, but the planets allow you to mitigate the damage of a bad draw. The fact that you start with your Warlord, who is essentially your best card on the board, that makes a big difference. Especially, now the Tyranids are out. Even if you get a really sucky draw with the Tyranids, you've still got your Warlord, you've still got your Synapse creature. Whatever happens, you get to start the game with those two. And that's something that a lot of other LCGs and CCGs don't really offer.
Well, I mean, most definitely it seems as though it's always going to be a careful bit of a balancing act for developers to kind of juggle making a card game balanced with making it still exciting. And
Yeah.
there's always going to be that element of randomness when it comes to drawing cards.
Yeah.
It certainly seems as though you've been able to compete during other games and still do spectacularly well. I believe not only did you win the 2015 Conquest LCG World Championship, but you also played in a Game of Thrones 2.0 tournament that weekend.
So I also played in the 2.0 Melee on the Sunday when the Conquest wrap-up was happening. It was only a small tournament, so it was only 3 rounds, but I did manage to win that as well.
Well,
which was nice.
Absolutely fantastic, and it's got to be just a feather in Conquest LCG's cap, I guess, a little bit of, just another great thing about this game in that you can taste some other fantastic LCG, but you still come back to Conquest, I guess. But I'm sure everybody's curious to know what deck exactly it was that you brought to win the championship, and certainly it seems as though there was a hell of a lot of thought process that went into deck building and refinement for this deck, but I'll just run through it from top to bottom really quick. It was, of course, Packmaster Kith that was your chosen warlord. It was a 50-card deck, 28 army units, 6 attachments, 12 events, and 4 supports. You included 3 copies of Bloodied Reavers, 3 Incubus Warrior, 4 Kith's Chimera Masters, and 3 Klavex War Leader. We've got 3 copies of Rogue Trader, 3 Void Pirates, we have 3 Slith Mercenaries, 3 Siren Zithlex, and 3 Warlock Destructors. for your 6 attachments, you've got your signature Agonizer of Bren, you've got 3 promotions, and interestingly, you've got 2 copies of Shadowfield. For events, you've got 3 copies Archon's Terror, 1 copy of Foretell, 2 copies of your signature Pact of the Homunculi, and 3 copies of Raid, as well as 3 copies Superiority. For supports, you've got 3 Archon's Palace and 1 Chimera Den. So we've certainly seen a lot of Kith performing pretty well in tournaments. This isn't a tremendously non-standard deck, but there's definitely a few tweaks and refinements that kind of sets it apart from, I guess, the pack, if you pardon my vernacular there.
Yeah.
But what was your thought process into developing this specific deck? Like, why bring Kith and why this deck specifically?
So I was a bit torn on whether to actually bring Kith or not. Partly because I think Kith has received a lot of bad press, as it were, lately. And partly because I actually thought I might be facing a very anti-Kith field. And while I do think Kith, obviously I think Kith is a top tier warlord, I don't actually believe she's like miles ahead of the rest. And in an anti-Kith field, I actually thought it might be better to bring something like Ragnar, who has solid answers to most decks, including Kith. A bit of me wanted to go with something like Old One Eye and the Venom Throat Polluter, almost just to prove it could work. So I did. So it wasn't a case of I was definitely going to go with Kith. But then I also felt like, I know Kith. I think I can cut through anti-Kith decks if it comes to it with Kith. And also that, the meta will be facing in a year's time, if Fantasy Flight manage to get all their product out, will probably be a very different one. So in a way, this might have been the only chance for Kith to have her moment. And I kind of felt if I didn't bring the Warlord that I won UK Nationals with, I'd always kind of wonder what would have happened if I had.
Right.
And bringing her next year wouldn't, again, a completely different meta.
Yeah.
Might not actually be a good idea to bring her next year. So I don't know if you want more on that.
Well, I definitely think you have a really good point where we've had a little bit of a stall or a delay in having new expansions come out, but for all we know, maybe between now and next year, Kith won't get a single additional staple card, and even though she seems like a very powerful Warlord presence now, who knows, in a year or two, she could be the absolute bottom of the barrel. So this might be her one time in the spotlight, her time to shine. But, I certainly can't fault you for your Warlord choice, and tremendous congratulations to you again for taking the championship.
Cheers. I just had a thought. The other thing with Kith that nearly put me off her was that when there seems to be this idea that a lot of people might bring Kith, I think most people don't really like the mirror match because there's always a danger. It does just come down to kind of the draw of cards, as it were, luck of the draw. So when I thought there'd be a lot of Kith out there, that did make me think, do I want to bring something else so that at least I feel I have control over the matches, even if I might lose them? But as it happened, with all the kind of anti-Kith chat, I thought, well, maybe there won't be as much Kith. And, as it happened, there was a fair bit of Kith, but it certainly wasn't dominating. There were twice as many Space Marines out there. That was also part of my thought process, kind of how many mirror matches can I stomach?
Well, the day before the actual 7 rounds of Swiss, we did have that World Eater tournament, and earlier in this interview you mentioned Old One Eye and the Venom Throat Polluter. You did actually bring that Warlord and Synapse unit to the World Eater tournament, and what was your thought there? What were you hoping to accomplish?
That was, so I know that it was interesting listening to... sorry if I'm allowed to mention other podcasts. It was interesting listening to Eric Taylor on the Concast talking about how when he turned up to the World Eater and there wasn't like a lot of Kith around and there were all these different decks, and how he figured that was because people were hiding their decks. And I think probably some people may have been. But I think there was just a bit of experimentation happening. And for me... I just wanted to see how Old One Eye Polluter would run in a tournament, essentially. I did think maybe I should take Kith to because I actually haven't played that much Kith lately, just to, kind of practice and see how she ran against the field. But I was like, this is a really good opportunity to try a Warlord combination that I think could be really good, but I'm not seeing other people playing, and to test myself with that, because it's quite a kind of high concentration combination as well. There's a lot of options, a lot of things to think about. So I'm really glad that I took that to World Eater, because otherwise I'd be sitting here wondering I'd still be wondering how does it run in a tournament setting, essentially.
Sure. Well, I suppose, how did Old One Eye ultimately perform in that preliminary tournament?
So I went 4-1, which I think was third on Swiss, though the software seemed to mess up Swiss, so it was it seemed to mess up the strength of schedule, so it's a bit hard to tell. But the match I lost, my opponent played really, really well, but there was a window where I think if I'd done something differently, I could have won that. Wow. But that said, the fifth match, I probably should have lost, because I didn't play particularly well. But my opponent and I both were, I think, quite tired at that point. So one thing it did make me really realise is the importance of eating food during major tournaments, because we were in the little side venue where there wasn't any food, and didn't really get a chance to go out and get any. It was the day after we'd flown in as well, I think. Or maybe, was it the day after? Which day was it? Can't even remember.
It was a Thursday.
Oh, okay. It was a couple of days after, but I was still a little bit jet lagged, I think. So it made me kind of realise the importance of making sure you're kind of properly slept and properly nourished in a tournament, because I had no idea what was going on in the last 2 rounds of that, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I guess when it all comes down to it, we are just kind of, victims to being bags of chemicals, and we have to try to manipulate our biology to our advantage whenever possible, and to make the human condition as little of a drawback as it could possibly be. But I'm very curious about your deck list in particular here. You've got some interesting inclusions, you've got some interesting exclusions. Notably, you went with 3 copies of Siren Zithlex. There's no Solarite of Vetus to be found. What was your thought process with that omission?
So when Great Devourer came out, I did replace the Zithlex with a Solarite, just to kind of see what would happen. And Solarite did pull her weight. There were some interesting games where actually playing a Siren Zithlex and a Solarite as the first 2 deploys, and then even sometimes being able to trigger Taras, which Dark Eldar have no right to trigger. Was quite entertaining. But I think at the end of the day, I felt it didn't really fit with the cost curve. It's Solarite's a good card, but has no particular synergy with the rest of my deck and what it's trying to achieve. And while I know a lot of people don't like the fact that you can draw into a second or even a third Siren Zithlex and she's just a dead card at that point, I really do think she can make such a difference to a game that it's worth the dead draw, to be honest.
Right, and I think your thought process is similar for Archon's Palace. It's just so overwhelmingly powerful that it's worth the risk of a dead draw.
Yeah, I regularly play, well, I say regularly, it doesn't happen that often, but I happily play a hand where I've drawn 2 Archon's Palaces in my opening hand. Because, if I've shut off 2 cards off the opponent, it's not a big deal if I've lost 1 card myself. And I'll be shutting off stuff every round after that, so...
Yeah. Well, certainly something else I found interesting about this deck is that you've opted to run 2 copies of Shadowfield instead of Suffering. So instead of dropping an attached unit's attack value by 2, Shadowfield is still a 2 shield icon card, but it basically makes whatever attached unit immune to being dealt damage by army units with cost 2 or lower. I suppose, what was the rationale behind that substitution?
Okay, so this was actually a very last-minute change, and I have to give a shout-out to Michael Romano for lending me the Shadowfield, because I didn't actually bring any with me from England, so that was really nice of him. The idea was that, essentially, it was again that expectation that there would be a fair bit of Zaratha in the field, that there would be some Dark Eldar Chaos splits, and that there'd be stuff kind of teched against Kith, and that Shadowfield is useful for protecting against Flamers, Zaratha's Flamers, that is. It's useful for protecting against Warp Storms. And in that kind of matchup, I'm also more likely to try and choke resources than cards, which means I'm going to resource planets, which means I might have an excess of resources to be able to afford the card. While Suffering, has its uses. It's a good card. It's good against Aunshi. It's sometimes useful against Space Marines. It's occasionally useful in the mirror. It has kind of its niche uses. Those are kind of occasionally useful against Eldrath. Those are all matchups that I feel confident about anyway. So I decided to make the switch in case I ran into any trouble with Zaratha. As it happened, I didn't actually face Zaratha at any point. There was less Zaratha out there than expected. None of it made the cut. So it only ever was a 2-shield card. But equally, I never had a game where I thought, oh, I wish this was a Suffering. It would still have been a 2-shield card. So, yeah, it made no difference in the end of the day.
Sure, but I suppose a little bit of meta-sensitive flexibility certainly didn't hurt had the situation presented itself.
Yeah.
And I guess really the last cards I was personally curious about is you just happen to run one copy of Foretell, and I suppose what's the thought behind just one copy, and under what circumstance do you typically use that card?
Okay, so the one Foretell, I think here's an area of the deck where there were probably a few options. So I run 3 Superiority and 1 Foretell, and I run those 5 2-shield cards, of which Raid has its uses, and Shadowfield apparently maybe does, maybe doesn't. I think I could have gone 2 Foretell, 2 Superiority, or I could have run an extra 2-shield card in there, or one less 2-shield card and 2 Foretell, 3 Super. There were a few options around those kind of slots there.
Right.
I think for me, Foretell, it's situationally really, really good. Like anyone who saw the final would have seen that I used a Foretell there, to which cost me, Kith got bloodied, but it allowed me to keep the Warlock Destructor at the planet and then win that planet, which was quite important. Sometimes it can shut off Taris at a key moment, or Aatrox Prime, although I tend to try and find other solutions for those 2 planets. So, hence I didn't feel the need to run 2 or 3 Foretells. It also acts as a cantrip, when you get to trigger it. I've never done it, but I imagine there could be niche situations where you would, trigger Ivan yourself and cancel Ivan yourself just to get through your deck to another card.
Sure.
It gets you closer to that palace, closer to that den, closer to that war leader, or closer to that destructor, pretty much anything that might be useful. Yeah, but it's, for me, I guess it is competing with Superiority in that deck, and Superiority can also be a cantrip. It can be sometimes a card and a resource for a card and a resource, which gets you through your deck. Superiority has the flexibility to deny your opponent or to boost yourself and enable something like a Clivex. It could disable something like a Warp Storm. In an ideal situation, it does both. And I think I just felt that, especially in the early game, Superiority is more likely to have an impact than Foretell. Because, it gives you the flexibility to allow your opponent to win a planet or to not worry about that and then cancel it. But equally, in the early game, hopefully your opponent's not getting that key trigger anyway, though of course they can.
Well, I suppose kind of with all of the deck covered from top to bottom, I suppose what was just your general play style? Was this kind of a very long game type deck, or how exactly do you approach playing a standard game when piloting this?
So what I feel is one of the strengths of the deck and the way I kind of tried to build it, and perhaps the reason for some of those choices, is I wanted to make it as flexible as possible. Dark Eldar are, as we've covered, very strong, but they've also got some very glass units. The vast majority of the units have 1 hit point or 2 hit points. They can be vulnerable to certain things. Kith, while she's amazing at sort of the early game punch, especially by bringing, she can bring the Chimera, which gives her an output of 4 attack that no one else can reach. She's also hasn't got anything in particular to prevent her from getting bloodied if she runs into trouble. So they do have these kind of weak spots. What I wanted to create was something that could run the short game. It could run the long game. Something that could be very aggressive or it could be reactive. Something that could run off, so it could deny the opponent resources and therefore gain a lot of resources itself usually, but have a paucity of cards and run like that by being able to chuck out things like Clivex War Leaders, by being able to keep the Slith Mercenaries and the Warlock Destructors functioning. But equally, it could run off a paucity of resources and a lot of cards, and just use the shields and use the cheaper units and use the Chimera spam and shut down the opponent's cards. So it kind of finds the weakness in the opponent's game and goes after that. So yeah, that kind of flexibility. So I would say it's quite good at playing the long game, but it can play the short game where necessary. A lot of it depends on planets, matchup, what you draw. But if you hit some early Warlock Destructors and use Kith aggressively with the Chimera coming in with her, there's no reason why you can't take some early planets. Equally, if you get the card or resource choked down, there's no reason you can't play all the way to Planet 7 and just win from your economy. So yeah, it's designed to be able to do whatever it needs to do.
Right.
Obviously, some of that depends on card draw and other things. It's not perfect by any means.
Well, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier that you hadn't been playing Kith too much leading up to the championship, but what kind of preparation did go into getting ready for Worlds? It certainly seems as though it was a tremendous amount of thought that you poured into revising your deck and constructing your deck, but in regard to just actually playing out matches, how did you practice? How did you prepare?
So I tried to get in a few games before I left. I was quite lucky that a couple of guys in the local meta were quite free, and were willing to kind of play a few games. Because I'm from quite a small meta, it was hard to get a kind of variety of play styles or variety of warlords to play against. I was playing a lot of Old One Eye, a little bit of Ragnar, cracking out Kotias occasionally, so I wasn't necessarily playing that much Kith. I tried to give my Kith to other people now and then so I could play against it as well, but obviously it's not the same when somebody's playing a deck for the first time. Right. But yeah, I think it's hard to say really. I mean, obviously Thrones 2.0 had just come out, and so that was kind of competing with time for a lot of people. So yeah, I wouldn't say I did a ton of practice. I actually played quite a few games against Aon Shi because I hadn't played against him at all, and I thought, oh, he might turn up, and then it turned out like he basically was the least represented warlord at Worlds. So that kind of practice turned out to not actually be directly relevant at all in the end. Yeah, I wouldn't say I really did anything particular because I mostly didn't really have the kind of opportunity to do anything particular. I managed to get in a game against Eldorath, which was the first game I played against Eldorath in about 6 months, so that was useful. Wow. Although I don't think I faced Eldorath either. I just mostly faced Kato, Ragnar, and Kith.
Yeah.
And Nastreg.
Well, I guess across the entire lifespan of your having played Conquest, you've certainly gotten in plenty of practice, even if it wasn't immediately leading up to this event. But earlier, we happened to mention that oftentimes we can be victims to our own physiology, our own biology. Coming from the United Kingdom is a hell of a trip. I guess, what exactly was the process of traveling like? I know it was an enormously long flight overseas, but was that enjoyable? Was that exhausting?
So that was kind of, I mean, So the flight itself was more cramped than I kind of expected it to be, which was a bit irritating. And I didn't get that much sleep. I mostly watched average movies. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It certainly hit me a lot more on the way back, I think, but that's probably also kind of the burnout of a kind of week of non-stop gaming, I guess. Right. I mean, for me, I've had like some issues with health around muscle pain and fatigue, so I was a bit worried about how that would affect me. But as it happened, I was generally okay in America, which was nice, except that day of World Eater where I had no idea what was going on by the evening.
Right. Well, I suppose when it all came down to it, you did ultimately do very well. You managed to take home the championship. How about that initial day when you had your 7 consecutive rounds of Swiss with no more than just an hour break after round number 3 for lunch? Each match, I think, was 50 minutes or maybe 55 minutes. But how did your deck perform that first day?
So yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of the pacing of the day, because at the time I thought, oh, this is a really long day, and then I was kind of thinking about how the Thrones 2.0 guys had done that and gone straight to the cut,
Right.
and it was only sort of, I think yesterday or the day before, talking to someone, that I realised when I did the UK Nats, I think we had 6 rounds, but then we went straight to the cut, which was only top 8, but that still meant there were another 3. So there were 9 games back to back for UK Nats. So actually, this was a bit lighter, even though I didn't realise that at the time.
Yeah.
The first round bye really helped, so I actually only had to play 6 games on that first day. So the first one I think I played against Kato, and that was actually a pretty close match. I think that was when the jet lag did hit me a bit, or the lack of sleep, or just my own kind of mismanagement, as it were. And I was really tired in that game. But it was a really good game, and my opponent was really nice. And I think I was trying to draw through my deck to get to shields. I just had so many units, and I had the command to keep drawing. I had about 50 to 20 cards in my hand, no shields at all. And just one shield would have saved me at this particular planet, and I was just hoping that he would look at my hand and go, well, clearly he's got a shield, and retreat. And that's what he did, which was that was the smart thing for him to do. It just so happened I didn't actually have any shields.
Yeah.
And that probably allowed me to pull back into the game, and then all this stuff was stuck in his HQ train. So I had Kato as my first game, Ragnar as my second game. So I went straight in with a couple of Space Marines. And that was also the first time I played Kato in a long time, because nobody near me plays Kato anymore. Might have even been the first time I played against Kato since like the Nats in May.
Sure.
And then played a game against Ragnar where the choke worked out. And I think I had another Kato game. Again, the choke worked quite well, so that kind of wrapped up quite quickly. Then I had a couple of quite tough Kith mirrors. So the first one was the only game I lost in the Swiss, which was to the guy who went 7-0, Dustin. And he was, again, another... I was really impressed by the guys I played against. You never quite know going into a tournament. I think especially if, like me, you're not really familiar with that many tournament scenes. And I kind of hear stories from people who go to like Magic tournaments, things like that. And I think, oh, why would I ever want to go to something like that? No offense to anyone who does, but some of the stories you hear are kind of quite cutthroat, and It doesn't feel like fun, I guess. But everyone here, they were here to play a game. They were obviously trying to win the game, but they were also there to have fun, to chat to other people interested in the game, and it was just a really enjoyable. I think everyone I played against while I was there are people I would happily play against on like a weekly basis in the normal course of life. There was no one there who I was like, why would you do that? Or, anything like that.
Yeah.
So I had a Kith mirror against Dustin, and that was interesting because he opened with, I think he knocked 3 cards out of my hand on the first turn with like Murder Razor Wings, Pact to the Homunculi. So I was sitting there going, well, this is probably over. But I did manage to get back into that game. I think at one point he played a Clivex in a bit of an unusual way, and it didn't feel like the most efficient thing ever. I'm sure he had his reasons for it. And it's probably the only thing that he did that I wondered why he'd done it. Everything else was pretty much spot on. So I did manage to creep back in. I got a bit of command presence. I was drawing cards, had resources, thought, right, okay, if I hold at this planet, I can probably win. And I'm about to plonk down about 6 cards at this planet, so I've got a pretty good chance. And he draws his 2 cards, and the first thing he does is he plays Siren Ziflex. So my 6 units that I'm ready to blitz the planet with, which I think might have included a couple of Warlock Destructors, all came in tapped. So that was the end of that game. And then I had another tight Kith mirror against a guy called Rick, who, again, an absolutely lovely guy. And that one, he had the game under control. Well, not exactly under control, but he kind of had the presence to take planets and everything, and the kind of command presence. So I was like, the only way I'm going to win this game is if I can basically hold off at key planets and take planet 7. And then the timer was ticking down and down and down. I was like, oh no, if this goes to time, I'm going to take the modified loss, essentially, because I've basically got no planets here.
Right.
But I'm like, but if it doesn't go to time, I'm pretty confident that I've got it at planet 7. And to his credit, he didn't faff about. He didn't try and make it go to time to take that. He actually tried to make sure we finished so that it was a full game. And again, that was really nice to see, because hearing stories from some other people I know who play other games, you hear these stories of in that situation, someone would just try and stall.
Right.
So that was really good sportsmanship, and he was a really good player, and I'm really glad that he made the top 16.
Yeah. I mean, he's just to sing his praises really quickly. Rick is just a fantastic guy. When I was looking for a place to stay the first night I came in town, he actually let me stay in his guest bedroom. So kudos to you, Rick. Octagon user Popicon, so stand up guy. But how about your last match of the first day?
So my last match was against Elliot, the Nasdaq player who made top 4, and. Yeah, again, an absolutely fantastic guy. I was really glad, with these last couple of matches that I wasn't actually knocking these players out. When I saw the top 16 go up and saw that, Elliot was sitting there at 15, Rick was sitting there at 16, and Josh, who was the Kato player I played as well earlier, was sitting there at 14. I was like, I'm glad I didn't take them out of the running, because they were all great guys. But yeah, the last game against Nasdreg, and this was the Nasdreg deck that I'd heard had been taking out Kith over the course of the day. And honestly, I played a bit with orcs, especially in my Kotiaz. I used them as a splash. And way back in the day, I'd played once or twice with the orcs. But I'd really forgotten how orcs work, because it'd been so long since I'd, had any kind of experience with them, that I did sit there going, what events can orcs actually play on me in the combat phase? What do I have to be worried about if Elliot has some resources there? And I just couldn't for the life of me remember anything. I really had to sit and concentrate and think it through and be like, okay, so this is what could happen. This is what could happen. Yeah, I think, again, I ended up resource choking him, because I think he might have had a depot out, so he might have been able to get cards. And then just managed to kind of dominate through command presence, and I think I might have got Nasdreg into a bit of trouble at one point as well, so they had to play carefully with him. Yeah, but I was really glad that it didn't knock him out of the running.
Yeah.
Mostly because I was hoping that if he made it in, he'd take out a couple of other Kith decks, and then we'd get to face off, and that is what happened in the end.
Sure.
So.
Well, I suppose once Swiss was all said and done, where exactly did you place in the top 16?
So I placed 3rd in the top 16. So obviously Dustin had gone 7-0, and he was the one guy who'd beaten me. And then I believe Jamin was 2nd. I think I was like 0.02 on extended strength of schedule behind Jamin or something like that. But yeah, so I placed 3rd in the Swiss.
Yeah. Well, supremely well done. I suppose once you knew that you'd made the top 16 and you had another up to 4 games ahead of you the following day, any special preparations that went into just getting ready for the top 16?
So my plan had been to go home. My plan had been to go to the hotel. Going home probably wouldn't have worked out too well. My plan had been to go to the hotel and try and get an early night. But I thought, I wanted to pop by the First Planet guys were doing the beer and cigars thing at a bar down the road. I wanted to pop in there. And I thought, well, I need to get something to eat anyway. But I ended up staying there a lot longer than planned. And then I think I then went. So I had the Australian Nat champion Brandon was staying in the same room that I was staying in the hotel. I think both nights we ended up talking probably a little bit longer than either of us intended, which knocked into sleep as well. So yeah, I had plans for preparation, but they didn't really work out. Essentially.
Right. Well, I guess the morning of the event, whether you'd slept, whether you'd fed and watered yourself adequately or not, you had to show up, you had to play some games, and I suppose with the foreknowledge that you would ultimately take the championship, how did those final few games pan out for you?
So I thought it was all over about 5 minutes into my first game. I was playing Josh again. And because in our Swiss round, I'd kind of card locked him really early, I never really got to see what his deck did. And so in this round of 16 game, he sticks Maxos on planet 1 and promotes Maxos, and I'm like, okay. And he had initiative, but I figured if I went to planet 1 and he goes anywhere else, I can take out Maxos and potentially anything that gets brought in relatively easily.
Sure.
It's the nice thing about Kith coming in with a Chimera. She's quite good at stuff like that. And I figured, well, if he does come to planet 1, then he's not taking any command off me anywhere else, and I might still be, I can't remember quite what I had in hand and what I had in terms of resources, but I think I was like, I still might be able to deal with it, and if I can't, he's won the planet, but I'm slightly better off command wise, and I'm not exactly going to lose anything big. I'll lose the Chimera, and Kith might take a tiny bit of damage. What I wasn't expecting was for him to play Rally the Charge, which made Maxos a 10 attack unit that couldn't be routed because he's unique, obviously. So that was 10 attack on Kith. I was sitting there going, I've got a 3 shield card in my hand, but 10 attack down to 7 doesn't help me. So Kith got bloodied on round 1. And I can't actually remember how the rest of that game went, but I obviously found a way back in somehow. But yeah, I really thought it might have been over at that point. So that was the first game. Then I remember really needing the loo towards the end of that game as well. And the Netrunner, they were in between Netrunner rounds, so there was a massive crowd in the loo. I felt a little bit self-conscious having to kind of skip the queue. I think I said to someone, I've got about 30 seconds to go to a top 8 game, or they'll disqualify me. And that guy kind of yelled, We've got a top 8 guy, everybody move, which was really nice of him. But I was a bit like, oh, this is embarrassing.
Sure.
So my round of the quarterfinals was a really good game as well against a guy called Elliot, who was playing as Kith. He was actually playing as Kith Eldar, but he was playing a slightly different deck because I know he played Inquisitor Caius Roth on me at one point. He was a really lovely guy. That was a game that kind of swung forwards and backwards. That was a game where he got out Archon's Palace on turn 1, I believe. Is that what happened? Yeah, he got out. So yeah, it was interesting actually with the Kith mirrors especially, because I think I'd gone in with the perception that, the last Kith mirror match I'd played had been the finals of UK Nats, which had been in May. So I hadn't really had much experience with the Kith mirror, and I kind of had the impression it would come down to the luck of the draw most of the time. And sort of speaking to other people, there was often this kind of thing, well, it's whoever gets the den first, or it's whoever gets the palace first.
Yeah.
So I think I was quite lucky in that all 3 of my Kith mirror matches were proper contests. It wasn't over right up until the end in any of the 3 of them. Although obviously draw had an impact. I didn't enjoy having 3 cards nuked out by Dustin in that Swiss game, round 1, but it was a really good game in the end. And the game and the game here, I wasn't the one with the den. Elliot was the one, not with the den, sorry, with the palace. Elliot was the one with the palace. So I think it's not necessarily a case of if you get palaced, it's over, or even if you get denned, it's over. So yeah, in this game, he had the palace out early, so I thought, well, I'm not going to be getting much in the way of resources or cards. What can I do? I suppose I can try and make sure he doesn't get any either. So instead of trying to use my hammers to generate stuff, I just put my hammers where his hammers were all the time. So neither of us got anything, or he got a little bit. And I was able to make use of a couple of destructors I had, and kind of push at some key planets. And then we had a big bust up at one planet where so at this point I'd pulled back and it was more my game to lose. I then made some dubious decisions at this planet. I probably should have just tried to kill things as quickly as possible, but for some reason I kept hitting Kith, which actually meant that a lot of his stuff got to hit back. And so although I did win the planet, I didn't end up as well off out of it as I could have. So that brought the balance back a bit more. And then at the end, I did run into my Chimera Den, which sealed it. I think I'd probably have got it without the Den. I certainly would have if I hadn't played so strangely at that planet. So it kind of swung backwards and forwards. We had a kind of running joke at the beginning. He asked me if I could remind him about his Warlock Destructors, because he'd always forget. And then there was one turn where he said, "Oh no, what about your Warlock Destructors?" And he sort of reminded me about mine, because I hadn't got around to doing it yet. And I was like, "Hang on, you haven't done yours either." And he's like, "Oh no, I haven't, have I?" So we had a kind of bit of a back and forth over that, which was all good fun. So going into the top four, played Elliot again. Thankfully, he had knocked out 2 Kith out of the top 16, so I didn't have to play another mirror match. So I was very grateful for that. And I think, to be honest, in that game, I think I did just draw really well, and he was in trouble from the beginning, because with a Chimera Den out, it was hard for him to get mileage out of Nazdreg. There was always that threat of Nazdreg getting bloodied. And I think I had an early Palace as well, which meant it was hard for him to get cards and resources going. I think I took out some cards early, and then once his depots came out, I switched to try and take out resources. And that kind of early advantage, although he actually had more hammers on the board, I was then able to get my hammers out and able to get my combat units out, and it kind of overwhelmed him. I don't think there was much he could have done. Which sometimes happens. Obviously, it was good for me that I got a great draw in that game, but it wasn't necessarily great for a streamed quarterfinal.
Right.
But in any card game, that will occasionally happen. But, it was great to have an Orc player in the top floor, and it was great that it was him as well. So, and then moving on to the final. So the final, I didn't really know what to expect. So, 2 of my knockout games had been against people I played in the Swiss, and the other one had been against Elliot, the other Kith player. But Seth, I didn't really know much about. Michael, who had lent me the Shadow Fields at the beginning of the day, I knew that he'd been knocked out by Seth, but I didn't know much about Seth's deck. I'd heard that it was mono Ragnar. Or I'd heard there was a mono Ragnar going around at the top end, but I wasn't sure whether it was his or not. But I didn't know anything about what was in it. So playing that, I think I was more nervous than maybe I expected I would be. And at the beginning, I was just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do almost. I remember there was a move where where Ragnar turned up where Kith was, and he dealt the 2 damage to my Chimera Masters, and I think I was like, oh, that's all right. At least it's not a Chimera. And I completely didn't think about the fact that losing that hammer would mean that he got the 2 cards.
Ouch.
But then it was done, and so that was that. As anyone who saw the game would know, I got bloodied, I think, round 2 in that game. And that was, that was the use of Foretell. If I hadn't used Foretell, I could have avoided the bloody, but I think I would have ended up then getting bloodied off Aatrox Prime if I'd lost the battle. But either way, I felt like it was worth getting bloodied to push that battle and to do some damage back. And luckily that worked out. Otherwise, that would have looked rather bad. But it certainly made for a really interesting game. And again, I'm glad that obviously it's easy to say, I guess, if I've won it. But I was glad that it was a game that seemed to be entertaining for people to watch.
Well, it definitely drew all kinds of excitement when Kith ended up being bloodied. It was like, oh my god.
And then so from there it was a case of trying to lock Ragnar out of cards. Obviously the Palace helped again. And then once I was bloodied, again, this is kind of, I suppose, comes back to that flexibility within the deck. Often if I've got a Palace out, I'm looking towards a long game. But with Ragnar out there, I thought, I need to try and wrap it up a bit more quickly, because actually going all the way to Planet 7 or something, that might favour Ragnar, because he might, that's more time for him to get in that kill. So kind of looking at the planets and looking at what I had out, thought, if I can try and wrap it up and dodge getting killed. That seemed to be the way to go. And thankfully that did work out. I think there was a turn that a lot of people talked about where Ragnar retreated. Or in fact, that might have been after Kith. I think that might have been actually after Kith got bloodied. And maybe there was another one. I think there were a couple of times where people kind of questioned things, but I think Seth played really well. I had the Clivex War Leader in my hand, and if he hadn't run away at the point that he did, that would have come down. So I think it still would have swung towards me on that basis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly Seth is a stand-up guy. He's an impeccable player. Whether it was fatigue playing a role or whether it was just in his mind the optimal play, certainly it's difficult to speak as a complete outsider with this magical awareness of some of the cards that you have in hand, some of the cards that Seth had in hand. There's so many different factors that came into play. Yeah. So I certainly won't say what was or was not the ideal play, but it was a fantastic final match. It was great to see a pretty close one, a pretty harrowing game. And I suppose, what was it like once you were announced the champion? You got up, you had the interview with Team Covenant, you had your picture taken with the Hive Tyrant, you were presented with your trophy, that incredible playmat, the top 8 tarot size card planets. What was that whole experience like?
I think it was pretty surreal, really. I don't think I really kind of knew what was happening almost. I'm not really sure what to say about it. It was kind of like, it was nice to see that a few of the guys I'd met over the weekend were watching and, did some handshakes and congratulations. One of them said to me, something like, "I'm glad out of all the Kith players, it was you that won it." And there were a couple more comments like that, like, "I wish it wasn't Kith, but at least it was you." And so that was nice to hear. There's a bit of me that wishes it wasn't Kith, but I wouldn't have really wanted it to be a Space Marine either. So, it was, I think a lot of people were focused on just trying to make the top 8 for those planet cards, and sort of beyond that, I'm not sure we'd registered kind of, a lot of people asked about the kind of what card I would design, and I honestly didn't think about it right through the day. Sometimes I'd sit down at a knockout match and someone would ask about, so what card would you design if you were, maybe that was the key to it. Maybe everyone else was distracted thinking about what they'd design. I don't know.
It's entirely possible.
But I still only thought about it. I thought about it a bit on the flight back. But I'll have a proper think about it at some point.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's still plenty of time for you to decide.
Oh, yeah. So I think a lot of it was about, playing the game, trying to have fun, trying to be sportsmanlike and trying to win at the same time. And almost everything else was kind of a bit, I don't mean to diminish any of that, but it was almost a bit peripheral, all these things happening around it and the attention and the, and stuff like that. It was really nice to, be asked to do interviews and things, but I didn't really know what was going to happen afterwards. I'd never been to a tournament on this scale, so, and I hadn't really thought, I hadn't woken up expecting to win it or anything.
Right.
So
you weren't so conceited.
Like, okay, and then this happens, and then this happens. It sort of was more happening to me, if anything.
Definitely. Well, did you do anything special to celebrate either that day or once you got home?
Not particularly. So I've actually stopped off to see family, so I haven't gone home yet. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, a few of us, went out for food and stuff that day, which was nice to hang out with some of the different guys there, some of the local Minnesota lot, and some of the, yourself and like Eric Taylor, who's part of the Conquest podcast, and a few kind of people who run podcasts or are known on the forums, or just guys who were there even, it's so yeah, it was nice to speak to a lot of people, hang out with people, get to know different people, but yeah, it's been a bit surreal. I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and he said he'd showed one of his co-workers at work the video of the final. And another friend of mine said she'd told her, she's a school teacher, and she said she'd told her class that she was going to going to see the Conquest World Champion, as if they knew what that meant at the weekend. So it's weird to have this kind of title that actually only means something to kind of a niche group of people.
Oh, for sure. It's always funny when Conquest bleeds into into the real world. But I guess just as a way of kind of bringing this interview to a close, I just have some more kind of philosophical or abstract type questions to bother you with.
Sure.
And clearly, you've demonstrated that you're a slightly better than average player by winning the World Championship. But what are some ways that you think about an ongoing game that might be different than a casual player? Like, what are some of the variables that you keep in mind while you're playing a game?
So I think part of it is looking towards the future. I think this is part of playing as Kith as well, because Kith, and I guess it would be true of Eldorath, they're wars that sometimes are looking towards the long game, and if you settle into that kind of thinking. So I would actually say, even if you don't particularly like the idea of it, it might be worth playing a game or two as Kith or Eldorath just to try and do the thinking in that way. So what I mean by that is sometimes you're not looking at which of the 3 planets can I take to win. You're looking at what are the 3 planets my opponent's going to take to win. Well, if I take that one, then that delays the game by another 2 rounds because he can't win till this one. And if I then take that one, that delays it till planet 7. And by planet 7, my economy is, it's created a big enough advantage that I'll just win at planet 7. Or I've already put something important up there that's going to help lock it down, like Siren Zithlek, say. I think a lot about how to stop my opponent winning, rather than how to make myself win, because they are effectively the same thing in a 2-player game. I think I'm often thinking about where I'm going to deploy my Warlord at the start of the deployment phase. I've noticed, I think there was a game in Swiss where I actually picked up my dial and had already turned it around, and my opponent was like, "Are you passing already?" And I was like, no, I'm just thinking ahead.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that decision there can then change based on what my opponent does. But I think it's useful to almost be pre-planning that. So this part of that might be thinking, actually, I don't need to challenge my opponent at command here because I'm planning on probably going there to Warlord snipe anyway. Now, obviously, your opponent might realise that, so there's obviously anything with Warlord commitments is kind of a constant game of bluffing and outthinking your opponent. But yeah, I would say that's something I've definitely noticed I do, is that I think, and especially with old One-Eye Venom Throat Polluter, sometimes I'm like sorting out both my dials before I put anything down just to get in my head, right, this is my plan. Mm-hmm. It's going to change depending on what my opponent does, but this is what I want to go with at the moment. I think being aware of what your opponent can do, like knowing that Chaos can warp storm you, and then deciding what you might or might not need to do about that. Sometimes you're like, okay, that's fine, he'll use 3 resources, he'll get rid of the warp storm, I'm happy to lose this planet if it comes to it. Other times it's like, you know what, he might not even have the warp storm, but I'm going to play that superiority to make absolutely sure he can't do it, because right now I can't afford for it to happen.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing.
Well, avoiding unnecessary risks certainly makes sense. Playing a longer game, I think, when possible, to continue to leverage favorable economic conditions, definitely makes perfect sense to me.
And always remembering the planet abilities as well. It's amazing how many games I sit down and play where people afterwards are like, yeah, I didn't actually think about the planet triggers when I made all those moves. I didn't realise you could do... especially when there's a trigger at round 1 that can affect something upstream. The amount of times I've seen, or myself, that I've been like, oh yeah, hang on, I made this whole plan forgetting that when you win planet 1, you're going to route my unit, right, or you're going to move your unit in, or something like that. That's something that I think is really easy to miss. So I think, all sorts of, I suppose, in a way, they're kind of obvious things, but they're also easy things to forget to do.
Yeah. Well, kind of a very abstract and unusual question here, something maybe a little bit philosophical, but outside of factors like luck and card draw, why is it that a player of your skill level ever loses a game?
So I don't know how to answer that in a kind of a way that doesn't sound bad.
Right.
I think, I think, although you say outside of luck and card draw, I think when you've got two very highly skilled players, it will sometimes come down to luck. Even when you don't, it could do. I think the key thing is when you've got two highly skilled players, it rarely comes down to the luck of the opening draw. It can do, but very rarely. It usually comes down to both players playing really well and making either no mistakes or each making the odd mistake, and then you get right to the end, and that's where it comes down to the draw. And that kind of links to, I suppose, the other thing that happens is essentially it is often the person who makes the least mistakes, and however good a player you are and however well you've prepped with sleep and food and anything else, we're all human. We all make mistakes. I can certainly see mistakes I made over the course of the two games. And luckily they didn't end up, I was either able to come back from those, or my opponent made a mistake too, or whatever. And luckily it didn't cost me the whole thing. But yeah, I would say I can certainly think of a few games where both players have played very, very tightly, and it's come down to one small mistake from one player. So that's, either that or you go all the way towards down to the win planet, and it does happen to be who top decks what. But usually it is a mistake because there's so much complexity and tactical depth that that is a thing that will happen over time. Sometimes as well, it's someone has to take a gamble. So it could be a really clever move and it pays off, or it doesn't pay off. It might be it'll pay off if my opponent doesn't have this card. They might not have that card, but I've got to take the gamble. So it can be a few things like that. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Well, it was a very difficult question to attempt to answer, and I very much appreciate all your thoughts on the subject. But really, one of the last things I wanted to ask here is whatever people's current thoughts are about balance in regard to Conquest, whether Kith and the Space Marines run the entire show, or whether there are other prominent contenders. Given what we've seen so far, coming out in the Planetfall cycle, do you view our meta being radically different in a year from now? Like, are there any warlords that you're personally interested in coming out soon?
Well, I think the first thing is I'd have to have Fantasy Flight tell me how many expansions they're actually going to release in the next year.
That's a very fair question.
Without knowing that, I can't necessarily answer the question. But having said that, obviously Planetfall will be out. Hopefully the Necrons will be out, and who knows how they will mix things up. In terms of Planetfall itself, I think Starblaze looks really strong to me. I can see Starblaze being a contender for Worlds 2016. I like the look of Gorzod. I don't know how well he'll do. I'd like to think that if Elliot takes him up, he could, make top four again, as long as he doesn't knock me out on the way. I think most of those warlords that we've seen look pretty good. Broderick War's interesting. I'm not sure he's much stronger than Kotiaz, but I can see one or two cards making Kotiaz a top tier warlord, and I can see Broderick War making it. The Gene Stealer guy, Dark Eldar guy doesn't look great, but Dark Eldar still have Kith, so the Space Marine guy looks very strong. I think I could see Mavros being a contender. I would hope Space Marines don't win, because I never want Space Marines to win, even though I like a lot of the Space Marine players out there and do occasionally play them myself. I would like to see Starblaze doing well. I'd like to see Gorzod doing well, and I could see that as a possibility. I think Old One-Eye Venom Throat Polluter is a very viable build as well, and will get stronger with cards. Even the cards we've already seen, like Striking Ravener, adds a lot to him. So I expect to see a fairly diverse field, but it's hard to say. I don't know what the cards are. I don't know what people will do with them. I don't know if there's stuff even with what we've already got that people might suddenly unlock. I think, it's true that Space Marines and Kith are at the top of the curve, but I also think, we're not necessarily looking at all the options for how to counter that. A lot of the good players are sticking to that. I didn't bring something else at the end of the day. A lot of the good Space Marine and Kith players who were in the top 16, they didn't go for something else. If we'd all gone for something else, would that have changed things? I don't know. We had an Eldar in the top four. We had We had an Azdrag in the top 4, so certainly doable. And who knows what would have happened if a load of people had played Anshi, or if Kingsley had turned up with his Zaratha, or if Eric Taylor had filled out his form correctly and made the top 16. There's I think, I'm certainly not going to say that Archon's Terror or Clive's War Leader are not very good cards, but I'm not convinced that it's just a case of include these cards. A bunch of other Kith players did that and didn't make top 4. I think there are certain Warlords that are slightly better and certain cards that are slightly better, but I don't think there's any matchup between two very good players where you can say, well, that Warlord's just going to win because he picked that Warlord, with the sole exception of Urian. Urian is going to lose. But, you can take Kith and Aunshi, or you can take Ragnar or Kato and the Swarm Lord, and you can't say, well, Ouchie's going to lose. Well, the Swarm Lord's going to lose. And I think that's a good thing. I think comparing it to a lot of other LCGs out there, I think the balance is actually a lot better. It's not perfect, and it'll never be perfect, as long as the designers are always striving to make it better. That's the main thing, I think.
Yeah, well, after meeting Brad Andrews in person, after meeting so many of the people, some of the players, some of the playtest group he surrounds himself with, I have, the utmost faith in his ability to do a damn decent job for being a few-person operation that he runs to develop this game. But, thank you so much, Varun, for all your thoughts, all of this interview today. I suppose I just kind of wanted to end by asking, Jeremy Zwern was disallowed from participating in this year's World Championship because he's now an employee of Fantasy Flight Games, but do you see yourself making a return appearance for the 2016 World Championship?
I would really hope so. My understanding is that I get a place, but that if I want flights and accommodation paid for, I have to win the Nationals again.
Right.
But even if I don't, I would hope, I don't know where I'll be or how things will be in a year's time, but I would hope I'd be able to make that trip. It seems like it would be poor form not to turn up and try. And again, I would really love, it was a great experience. There were great people there, and it would be a shame to miss out on that. So yeah, I would hope so. I played a couple of friendly matches with Jeremy, and we went 1-1. So I guess we have to have a decider at some point. So I should probably return for that.
Well, sounds very good to me, but I suppose in closing, any final thoughts, words of wisdom, or pieces of advice you'd like to throw out there to our community?
That question always feels like a lot of pressure. I think it's, play what you enjoy, keep playing, practice, try new ideas, don't just accept something is true because everyone on the internet said so, or because I said so, or because the Hive Tyrant said so even. I think there's probably a lot of things that we've all missed. I think Elliot proved that with his Nazdrag deck. Everyone had written off Orcs as a thing, and he made it to top 4. And, on a different day, who knows, he might have gone further.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's just, keep playing. There's a guy I was lucky to be able to practice with a bit before I left, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but at the beginning I was pretty much annihilating him every time, but he said he enjoyed it and it was helping him get better, and sure enough, just before we left, his Aunshi did take out my Kith deck in a game, and that came from him practicing, playing it again, starting to see that if he looked ahead and starting to realise what I was likely to do and get used to that, and yeah, there was I believe there was a 12-year-old who went 4-3 or 3-4 with Eldorath, was it? Or with...
I think it was, yeah, Ben Volpe. I think he's a 14-year-old that I believe was playing Eldorath.
Yeah, and there was another, and I think there was a 12-year-old the day before at World Eater running Old One Eye. And I know a couple of people who played against him said he was, a really good tactician and was doing some really clever stuff. So, yeah, I think I don't really know what I was saying, but something about kind of backing yourself and just trying different things and just looking at the different options and keeping at it, really.
Well, absolutely fantastic. If there's anything you said that I can definitely get behind, it's, keep at it, keep playing, and question everything. Be very open to advice, but certainly keep that skeptical mindset and really question both what people are telling you and why they're telling you that. But Varun, thank you so much for coming on. Congratulations again on an incredible tournament performance, 2015 World Champion. Thank you for the interview.
Cheers.
And unless there's anything else, have a fantastic evening.
No, that's pretty much it. Thank you for the bananas that helped keep me functioning during the tournament round.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone out there who made it a great experience. Brad, Mitch for the bananas, Michael for the shadow fields, all the guys who I played against, or played friendlies with over the time there. Eric, Josh, Elliot, Chris, Rick, Brendan, Peter. I could go on and on and on. I had a really funny experience in World Eater where Taji Bear from the forums, I think he's called Ben, I sat opposite him, put down my old One-Eye Polluter deck, and he said to me, "Oh yeah, I read all about that deck on Card Game DB. I was actually going to play it today, but then I decided to play Kith instead." And I was like, "So you know exactly what my deck does and exactly how to beat it." Oh, great. But it was also kind of flattering. And it was nice to kind of put names to faces. I mean, I had met him once before, but it's nice with other people to put names to faces and things. And yeah, hopefully I'll see a lot of those guys next year, and hopefully some new faces too. And yeah, for all those playing Conquest, I just would encourage you to keep playing it. It's a great game. Don't give up just because Fantasy Flight release material haphazardly, or because your meta might all play Thrones. Although that's a great game too. So just thank you to everyone, really. And hopefully this has been vaguely helpful, but feel free to disagree with anything I say, because it's not all correct by any means.
Well, I definitely appreciate your time, and I definitely appreciate your humble nature. So congratulations again, Varun.
Thanks.
And take care. Hope to see you next year.
You too.
Well, with our interview having drawn to a close, I'll just conclude this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Interacting with viewers like you will always remain the absolute highlight of my continuing to create content for this channel, so please take a moment to let me know not just what you thought of this interview, but also please provide feedback in regard to how I could improve. For instance, what questions could I have asked, and what topics could I have discussed with Varun? And as always, I remain ever open to constructive criticism. If you know someone that would make a good candidate to guest star in a future video or interview, I encourage you to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this content, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're always encouraged to share, because the more engagement this content receives, the more viewers, the more listeners are reached, and ever the broader you help us to grow our Conquest community. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd encourage you to do so through Twitter or on Facebook, and if at any point you feel so inclined to help support the Hive Tyrant, I'd be absolutely honored were you to donate to my Patreon. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.